So I am with Department of Wildlife Resources. I am our deer, bear, turkey biologist, but thankfully we do have project leaders for those three species groups too. So I run part of those programs, but we've got Matt Knox in our deer program, Carl Tugend in our bear program, and then Mike Dye is our turkey grouse biologist. So I do have some other people I work with on these species. So today I'll give you a super uplifting talk about chronic wasting disease in Virginia. So not nearly as much fun as learning about mesopredators, unfortunately. So first off, let's just go through what is CWD, or chronic wasting disease. And probably for most of y'all, this is old hat. You've heard about it, but we'll just run through the basics and then kind of get into the meat and potatoes of it here in Virginia. So CWD, or chronic wasting disease, is a progressive neurological wasting disease of any member of the Cervidae family. So deer, elk, or moose are susceptible to this disease. And unfortunately, it is 100% fatal. So if an animal gets it, there's no treatment, there's no vaccine to prevent it. And thus far, with a lot of testing, there hasn't been any signs of genetic resistance. So if a deer is exposed to it, they're going to get it and they will end up dying from it if they're not harvested by a hunter or hit by a car or something first. So the clinical signs, which it takes a long time for the clinical signs to show up in a deer, but they'll end up being severe emaciation. I mean, they stop eating, and then they get these neurological signs. So loss of fear of a person, they'll just stand there and let you approach them. And then they'll get this really wide-legged stance, head will be down, ears are probably drooped back. They may be drooling, sometimes they're spinning. So obviously, if you ever see a deer looking like that, that's not normal, not healthy. It's feeling pretty rough. And it's caused by an abnormal infectious protein called a prion. So this is kind of the weird part, how does a deer get CWD? What is it? It is a prion disease, which makes it really hard to explain to a lot of people. But you can think of it in the same class. Chronic wasting disease is in the same class of diseases as some other diseases that people are a little bit more familiar with. So these are all grouped into a group known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. I'm not going to try to say that one again, but basically mad cow disease falls into this same set of diseases, Creutzfeldt-Jakob in people, and then Scrappy in sheep. So these are diseases people are a little more familiar with. CWD is in that same class. So these prions can remain active for quite a while in the soil and out on the landscape. So this is how come they're so highly infectious. And literally, it is just a misfolded protein that causes this disease in deer. So then how is it spread? And this is kind of the million-dollar question and what's been going on across the landscape. So we know deer to deer. So if a deer has CWD, they've got that misfolded protein, the prion that has caused CWD. If they're in contact with another deer, they can cause it. So that deer to deer, nose to nose touching, if they're feeding out of the same feed pile somewhere, that's going to spread CWD between those deer. But then it can also spread through the environment. So when a deer urinates or defecates on the landscape, they're depositing those prions on the landscape. And then it's possible another deer can pick it up from going back through there and eating from that area where that deer has been. So you've got both deer to deer and environmental spread. The big bummer with CWD is that when a deer gets it, it takes quite a while for those symptoms to come out. So they can harbor the disease for up to 2 years and literally look healthy. So a deer may look just like perfect white-tailed deer, no signs or symptoms, but they are in the meantime spreading prions across the landscape and to other deer. Normally, you will only see these signs of the disease in the later stages. So usually within months of that deer dying, if it's going to die of CWD, it's in those last few months that you get that emaciated look. They start showing neurological symptoms. In Virginia, thus far, of all the deer we have tested that have been positive for CWD, we've only had 5 that were clinical suspects. So 5 deer that somebody called in and said, hey, this deer looks sick, looks bad. We went out and dispatched it and tested it. All the rest of the deer we have tested that have been positive were hunter harvested or road killed deer that were absolutely healthy looking. So that's one big thing we iterate to hunters about the importance of getting your deer tested. You can't look at a deer and know that it has CWD. And it's a huge threat to our deer population and to deer hunting in Virginia because of those population impacts it can have, the 100% fatality rate, and just what it means to hunters to have this out on the landscape and how it impacts their willingness to hunt and then consume deer meat once they know that CWD is on the landscape. So where do we have CWD? So if you go out big picture, we're not alone in Virginia, and we actually, the East kind of makes up a small portion of where CWD is present. As you can see from this map, all of the grayish colored blocks, gray to black, those are wild free-ranging deer populations that have confirmed chronic wasting disease in them. The yellow and red dots are captive facilities that have had chronic wasting disease found in them. And we're lucky in Virginia, we do not have a captive deer farming industry. And so that is a huge plus for us to really stop the spread of CWD. But for a lot of these other states, that's where it started. And then that's how it ends up in a lot of other regions, is as deer move on the back of pickup trucks or trailers to new states, then they can spread it that way as well. So we're really lucky to not have those captive situations here in Virginia. So as we zoom in a little bit to how our outbreak in Virginia started, with a lot of things, we're going to blame West Virginia. So on this big map in the middle, all the purple blob is West Virginia. And then if you look up there in that kind of northeastern corner of West Virginia, that is where CWD started in West Virginia and then spilled over into Virginia. So West Virginia picked up their first CWD positive deer in 2004. They were looking for it. Basically, all the East Coast states started looking for CWD around 2002 because that was the first time it had jumped the Mississippi River. It was found in 2002 in Wisconsin. So after that, everybody in the East kind of got on high alert and started sampling and looking for it. So West Virginia picked it up first. They found it in 2004. Up in their kind of northeastern corner of the state. We started looking really hard about that same time. We were doing some statewide surveillance, but then we really honed in on that area adjacent to West Virginia. Sure enough, 5 years later in 2009, we picked up our first positive in Frederick County. Since then, it has just blown up in that Frederick, Shenandoah, northwest corner of Virginia for us. But we can blame West Virginia. We know it was a spillover from their original outbreak that they had. So it was easy when we could say that. We said, oh, okay, that's theirs. That's where it all started out. It slowly has moved eastward across Virginia up in that northwest corner. So Frederick County, Shenandoah. Now we've got Clark, Warren, Loudoun, Fauquier, Rappahannock, Culpeper, and Madison. So on the map, kind of to the right-hand side there, the first disease management area we created was that orangish colored block. Then as it moved a little further eastward, we've got that blue block that was created due to a positive in Culpeper County in 2018. And then last year, January of 2021, we picked up this oddball down in Montgomery County. And so we'll talk about that one. That is our latest, our brand new disease management area down in Montgomery, Floyd, and Pulaski. So let's hone in on just the Virginia aspects of CWD. So there's where we started, one little dot in Frederick County. That first positive was literally on the West Virginia line. The property owner where that deer was harvested, part of his property went into West Virginia. So we were right there, but it didn't stay there very long. So if you look at how we kind of have sampled and found detections in Virginia, it starts out pretty flat. So this is, again, another thing we really reiterate to our hunters is that, nope, just because we found one positive, we may not find hundreds right away, which is great. That means we're kind of on the leading edge of finding an outbreak. So that's really good. So in Frederick County, we found that first one in 2009. From 2009 to about 2015, we had less than 5 positives a year we were picking up. And we were sampling a lot of deer in Frederick, Shenandoah, Clark, and Warren counties. So for those first few years, it stayed, we get 1, 2, 3 positives. Then around 2016, it jumped. So then we had 10 positives. Then by 2018, we're up to nearly 30 positives in that Frederick County area. So at that point, we could basically call Frederick an endemic zone. It has got CWD. It is all across the county. For the first few years, we were only finding positives on the western side of Frederick. By around 2014-15, we were picking up positives on the eastern side of the county. So Frederick County is basically considered an endemic zone. It has CWD in it. So at that point, we don't need as much testing. We know it's there. We really need to get in front of these new places. So in 2019, we dropped back the amount of sampling and surveillance that we're doing up in Frederick just to focus in. We have all these other counties that we need to get samples from. So we cut back. So yes, the number of positives detections up there went down, not due to CWD going away. They went down because we're not sampling as many deer up there. As most everybody probably realizes, we're a state agency. We've got budgets. Every one of these tests costs money. So we need to focus our testing efforts where we're trying to pick up new outbreaks and get ahead of it rather than kind of where it already is and established. So like I said, that first positive was up there in Frederick County in 2009, right on the border. Since then, it was fairly slow. We had kind of a slow bump out into Shenandoah, Warren, Clark County. And then 2018 was a big one for us. We had this big jump into Culpeper. So that was really unexpected. That was a pretty long ways. It was about 44 miles to that positive in Culpeper from the leading edge of where one had been positive in Frederick or Shenandoah County. Not impossible for a deer to walk that far, but it's pretty good trek for a white-tailed deer to move that far. So we started sampling heavy down in that Culpeper, Madison, Orange area. Thus far, it's been pretty quiet. Last year, we did find one positive there on that Madison Culpeper line, but we picked up one in Rappahannock, Warren, Fauquier, and Loudon. So last year was a big year for finding new positives, unfortunately. But I will say we were looking really hard for them, so we're picking more of those up. And then, as we mentioned, the Montgomery one, which we'll get to in just a minute. So how are we looking for CWD in Virginia? So you can see in those early years, we had pretty low sample sizes. We were doing some statewide surveillance, but we basically were using our district biologist and saying, hey, in your county, try to get us 10, 20, 30 samples, as many as you can from hunt clubs and hunters in your county. So for those first few years, we were averaging under 1,000 samples a year. Now we're up around 6,000 samples, 5,500 to 6,000 samples a year, doing targeted surveillance in our disease management areas. Plus, we use statewide taxidermists and meat processors. So since 2018, we have enlisted taxidermists all across the state, not one in every county, but we pick ones that usually get deer from multiple counties. And those taxidermists have helped us out tremendously in finding a bunch of these new positives. The Montgomery County, Rappahannock, Fauquier, and I believe the Loudon positives last year all came from taxidermy samples. And that makes sense because the $1 million sample that we would call it, or the biggest bang for your buck, is a mature buck. Those are the deer that are moving across the landscape. They can harbor the prion for a long time and spread it. So getting those older mature bucks, which are what are normally turned in at a taxidermist shop, really help us out in finding these positives across the landscape. So then our oddball, our newest detection down in Montgomery County. So this was, again, turned into a taxidermist. A guy harvested a buck, took it to his taxidermist, and boom, comes back as a positive in this whole new area that if you'd have asked any of us in the deer program, hey, where are we going to find the next positive? That wasn't the place we were betting on. So this kind of surprised all of us. And we said, oh, goodness, now what? Well, first thing we did, we went and looked at our previous surveillance. What samples did we have? And we actually had pretty low numbers. So we had taxidermists and some meat processors working with us in this area already, but we really weren't getting a ton of samples. And then if you go west of there into Giles and Craig County, we had really, really low numbers of samples. So we knew, okay, kind of a blank book here. We're not sure what we're dealing with in this area. But we created a new disease management area, Pulaski, Montgomery, and Floyd, that this year had a lot of new regulations in place. So what do we do in response? When we get one of these detections, then what happens? Well, we've got, just like everything, we're the government, we've got a plan. It's actually not that long. It's maybe only 20 pages long, so that's pretty good. But we've got a plan for how we're going to respond to it and then what steps go in place kind of in a stair step to deal with a new detection. So as of last year, then we created that DMA3. We call them, these used to be called containment areas, but we switched the language around. Now they're all called disease management areas. And I'll show you a map on the next slide that looks at all of them. But last year we made a new one that had that Floyd, Montgomery, and Pulaski County. And then anytime you get a positive detection, then we put in some mandatory regulations. So carcass transport goes into effect. So we restrict, you cannot take a whole deer out of the disease management area because we don't want you taking that deer into an area that does not have CWD and depositing the spinal column, the brain stem, and all of those possibly infective parts out on the landscape. So you cannot take a whole deer carcass out of any of the DMAs. Deer feeding prohibition goes into effect. So any county within 25 miles of a detection automatically gets wrapped in no deer feeding. And we've been trying piecemeal to do that statewide. CWD is helping us out. We'll eventually get statewide prohibition of deer feeding. And that's just to limit the congregation. You don't want animals nose to nose over, a pile of corn or bird seed or whatever somebody is putting out to feed these animals. And then we also take out fawn rehabilitation in any disease management area. Again, just limiting contact and having animals grouped up together. So here are a bunch of maps that just kind of show once you become a DMA, we end up with all of these sampling options because we're looking, again, we want to see what you've got on the landscape. So DMA1, that far left-hand map there with Frederick, Clark, Warren, and Shenandoah. Up there, we did a mandatory sample day in Shenandoah County this year, but most of the sampling up there is just voluntary drop points. We put these refrigerators out on the landscape at certain areas. It's posted on our website and in our digest, and hunters can just take a deer head, put it in the box, they fill out a little bit of information, and we'll sample it. Because we want any hunter that's in a DMA, if they want to get their deer tested, we want to test it for them. DMA2, same thing. We have got some stations where you can drop off a deer head. And then again, we had some mandatory sample spots in Madison, Culpeper, and Orange that we actually just did this past Saturday. And then same thing in Montgomery, Floyd, and Pulaski. We have drop-off stations. Again, just these big coolers that are sitting out, usually at gas stations, firehouses, some local spots that people know about. And you just roll up there to it, cut the head off your deer, put it in a bag, throw it in the cooler, and we'll come pick it up a couple times a week and pull samples. And then these were all the spots that just this past Saturday, we were hanging out in the New River Valley, and any hunter that harvested a deer on Saturday in Floyd, Montgomery, or Pulaski had to bring it by one of our check stations. And it actually, even though it wasn't the best weather day, it was pretty windy, we did pretty good. We got about 300 samples down there on Saturday, so we were pretty happy. So this just kind of looks at some of that surveillance. That's what one of the drop boxes look like. Of course, still has our old logo on some of them, but it's just a freezer that's been converted actually to just a refrigerator. Those are hanging out in a bunch of areas. They can be found on our website and in the digest where they are. So we've got a lot of those, again, just for any hunter, anytime during the deer season, they can drop a deer off and we'll test it for them. We did the mandatory sampling days. That's always the first day of the general firearms season. And we had stations out all across those different DMAs on Saturday. But we don't just use hunter harvested deer on those days. We also work with VDOT and contractors to do roadkill. So we have some great folks that run around and pick up dead deer off the side of the road in all of those disease management areas. And we actually, if it's a contractor or VDOT working with us, we pay them for each deer head that they give us, as long as they give us the location information. A head with no location is no good to us, so we've got to have that location info. Then we also work with the processors. We've got a lot of deer processors that have been excellent to work with. Again, they just keep the head, they get us some location information. We go pick it up and pull the sample. They get paid for that as well. Same with our taxidermists. So again, these guys, we've been working with them statewide since 2018, and it's been amazing. These folks are really well trained, and they've just been awesome to work with, and they love trying to help out. But again, we're paying them. So it's not a cheap endeavor. Once you get chronic wasting disease in your state, a lot of resources go to surveillance, sampling, and figuring out what to do about it. So it's not cheap, but this has been probably the biggest bang for our buck is working with these taxidermists. And they have found a bunch of our primary positives in new areas. And then the last part of what happens once you get a detection is we do usually end up loosening up regulations on some hunting. So extending seasons to try to get increased harvest. One of the biggest things, we need our deer densities to be reduced a little bit to lower spread, lower transmission. And so we end up putting in these extended either early and or late antlerless only deer seasons. A lot of these counties, we make sure that they're full season. You can kill a buck or a doe. And then in some counties, you end up going to where you actually have to earn a buck. So before you can kill your second buck, you have to kill a doe. So all of those just trying to get more deer harvest, which is tricky because at the same time, we've been seeing decrease in license sales before CWD was on the landscape, but we just have less hunters in the woods. And then once CWD is on the landscape, what does that do to our hunters? So that is in the works. We've got some human dimensions work that we're working on to kind of get hunters' ideas and values, what happens once they know CWD is on the landscape and how that impacts their willingness to harvest a deer and then later consume that deer. Another reg that we put into place, probably 4 or 5 years ago was the statewide ban on using any deer lure that's got a natural secretion or natural deer fluid in it. And this is because those prions can concentrate in the urine. So we don't want somebody pouring out prions on the landscape somewhere unknowingly. So that went into effect several years ago statewide. The carcass transport, this is probably the most confusing piece of all of CWD management that we get a ton of phone calls about. This little map is in the digest, but we answer a lot of questions. But basically, you cannot bring a whole deer into Virginia and you cannot take a whole deer out of a DMA. You got to bone it out, got to take just the antlers cut off from the bone, things like that. So we have got some really great instructional videos on how to cape out a deer, how to bone out a deer, what you need to do. But this is probably the thing that has been the trickiest for hunters to learn what they need to do with their deer before they leave a disease management area in the state. This is just our videos that we have up online showing people how to do this and how to take things and where they can take it. And then the last piece of it, it's not a regulation, but we do work with the counties that are in disease management areas to provide landfill or to provide like green boxes, dumpsters for them to dispose of deer carcasses in. So rather than just throwing the carcass out on the landscape in each of these counties with CWD, we have got dumpsters out there that we call the carcass collectors that you can then throw your carcass into. It gets picked up several times a week and then taken to a lined landfill where it can be put in there. And then that way it's not out on the landscape. Other options are just burying it or disposing of it near the point of harvest. They're not as good. So if possible, we do encourage hunters to take them to one of these landfill green boxes that we have got out there. And then ultimately, prevention is our best management option because we've seen, and other states have seen, once it is on the landscape, eradication is pretty darn near impossible. So once it's out there, it's really hard. And then you've got to work really hard to try to get in front of it. So preventing it by not moving deer around, making sure we've got these carcass restrictions in place, banning on feeding, anything like that, just to help limit congregation and any type of spread are really good. And then once we get in an area, having these liberalized hunting regs and the rest of those restrictions, as well as our increased sampling and outreach efforts really help to try to get the message out to folks. So it's not exactly a happy scenario, but we're trying to stay ahead of it as best possible. And it seems like, thankfully, we've got pretty good options and teams in place now to do that. So with that, I will take any questions. Those are links to our wildlife disease webpage, and the one is just specific to CWD. Tons of good information on there for hunters, landowners, just anyone interested. There's a lot of good stuff on those 2 web pages.